the family that transformed their own children into aliment. In Texas, this stands as the most cruel case of consanguineous relations. A statement that appears too horrific to be true. Yet in 1967, deep in the remote backwoods of East Texas, authorities would stumble upon evidence of precisely such atrocities. A routine missing persons investigation was what began this story, but it would unravel into one of the darkest chapters in American history. A story that local officials deliberately buried, hoping to spare the community the horrors of what transpired on the isolated Thornhill property. In the deep pine forests of Rusk County, Texas, where dirt roads disappeared into thick woodland and neighbors lived miles apart, the Thornhill family had maintained a reclusive existence for over 4 generations. Their sprawling 120-acre property remained largely unexplored by outsiders, protected by no trespassing signs, vicious dogs, and a notorious hostility the family held toward visitors. In nearby towns, the Thornhills were whispered about, strange folk who never fully integrated into society, who married among themselves, and whose children rarely attended school. For years, Sheriff Robert Calloway had heard the rumors about the Thornhills, stories of misshapen children spotted at the property's edge, tales of unusual screams echoing through the forest at night. But in the late 1960s, law enforcement respected property boundaries with near-religious reverence, and without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, the Thornhills were left alone. On October 12, 1967, that changed when Eliza May Johnson reported her 16-year-old daughter, Cordelia, missing. The girl had last been seen accepting a ride from James Thornhill, a 45-year-old man who occasionally ventured into town to sell handcrafted wooden items and produce from the family farm. When questioned, James claimed he dropped the girl off at the highway junction, but inconsistencies in his story raised Calloway's suspicions. Armed with a search warrant, Sheriff Calloway and 4 deputies approached the main Thornhill house on October 15. What they discovered would haunt them for the remainder of their lives. The primary residence, a large but dilapidated Victorian farmhouse, contained evidence of extreme squalor and neglect. But it was the root cellar beneath the kitchen that revealed the true horror. The stench was overwhelming, Deputy Wallace would later testify. Like a slaughterhouse left to rot in the summer heat. Inside, they discovered human remains in various states of preservation. Some hung from hooks like curing meat. Others were preserved in large salt barrels. Most disturbing were the glass jars, carefully labeled, containing preserved organs and other body parts. That the Thornhill family had practiced extreme consanguinity for generations, led by patriarch Silas Thornhill, was revealed by further investigations. What began as cousins marrying cousins in the 1880s had by the 1960s evolved into something far more sinister. Siblings bore children together, fathers procreated with daughters, mothers with sons. The result was a family tree that folded in upon itself in biologically impossible ways. Increasingly severe became the physical and cognitive impairments resulting from generations of inbreeding. Rather than see these children as victims of their practices, the family developed a twisted belief system. They viewed these imperfect offspring as a food source, a way to reclaim what they considered failed progeny. During the initial search, investigators found 19 living individuals on the property, many bearing obvious signs of genetic disorders, abnormal facial features, stunted limbs, and cognitive impairments. Evidence suggested that those deemed too imperfect were eventually killed and consumed by the family in a ritual they believed strengthened their bloodline. As Sheriff Calloway surveyed the scene of unimaginable depravity, he made a decision that would later become controversial. Concerned that full public disclosure would traumatize the community and attract ghoulish tourism, he classified much of the investigation. The official record would note only that the Thornhills were arrested for murder and other crimes against nature. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel to receive notifications when the next chapter is released. You will be shocked to your core by the scientific analysis of 4 generations of inbreeding and its catastrophic consequences. Back to the post-Civil War era stretched the roots of the Thornhill family's descent into madness and depravity. It was in 1868 that Jeremiah Thornhill, a Confederate veteran with a pronounced hatred for government authority, brought his extended family to the remote woodlands of East Texas. Historical records show that Jeremiah had already married his first cousin, Abigail, and together they had 5 children, 3 of whom survived to adulthood with noticeable intellectual deficiencies. Pathological was Jeremiah's distrust of outsiders. He forbade his children from attending school or interacting with neighboring families. Instead, he created a self-contained world on their isolated property, preaching a perverted interpretation of Scripture that emphasized purity of bloodlines and resistance to outside corruption. That Jeremiah Thornhill wasn't just eccentric is clear. He was systematically cutting his family off from society, explained Dr. Margaret Leland, historian at East Texas State University. He created the perfect conditions for generational isolation and abuse to flourish unchecked. In the second generation, the consequences of this isolation became apparent. With few options for marriage partners, Jeremiah's surviving children, Silas, Ruth, and Ezekiel, formed unions among themselves. County marriage records show no official documentation of these relationships, but birth records from 1885 through 1895 list children born to Ruth Thornhill with no father named. Census data from 1890 showed all three siblings still residing on the family property with their aging parents and several unnamed children. Increasingly visible became the effects of consanguinity by the third generation. Photographs recovered from the Thornhill property show children with classic signs of genetic disorders, unusually close-set eyes, malformed limbs, and disproportionate facial features. Medical records obtained from a traveling doctor who visited the property in 1912 noted concerning physical and mental abnormalities consistent with familial intermarriage. It was in this third generation that the family's darkest practices apparently began. According to journals recovered from the property, Ezekiel Thornhill, who had assumed leadership of the family after Jeremiah's death, instituted what he called the culling, a process whereby children born with severe deformities or impairments would be returned to the family's strength. Forensic analysis of bones found buried on the property confirmed that some remains belonged to infants and young children with significant skeletal abnormalities. By the 1920s and 1930s, the fourth generation of Thornhills had taken this practice to an unimaginable extreme. Under the leadership of Abraham Thornhill, Ezekiel's son, the family had developed an elaborate belief system around consuming their imperfect offspring. Family writings describe this as reclaiming the strength from failed vessels and purifying the bloodline by reabsorption. Ironically, the Great Depression provided cover for the Thornhills' practices. As many remote communities resorted to extreme measures to survive, neighbors who might have noticed the disappearance of Thornhill children assumed the worst consequences of poverty, not the reality of ritualized cannibalism. A brief period of outside contact was brought by World War II when two Thornhill men, James and Joseph, were drafted. Military records show they were quickly discharged due to psychological unsuitability and evidence of inbreeding. Nevertheless, their brief exposure to the outside world brought back new ideas to the family compound, including modern preservation techniques that would later be employed in the family's horrific practices. By the 1950s, the Thornhill property had grown increasingly ramshackle and isolated. Aerial photographs from a 1956 county survey show multiple structures in various states of disrepair scattered across the property. The main house, once an impressive Victorian farmhouse, had deteriorated significantly. Surrounding it were smaller cabins, sheds, and what appeared to be underground structures. The physical decay of the property mirrored the genetic decay of the family, noted forensic psychologist Dr. Robert Harlow. As their bloodline became increasingly compromised, so did their environment and their grip on any semblance of normal human behavior. It was into this nightmare that Cordelia Johnson unwittingly stepped in October 1967, accepting a ride from James Thornhill, who had been sent to town to acquire supplies, and, as investigators would later discover, to find new genetic material for the declining family line. Quickly expanding beyond the local sheriff's department did the investigation into the Thornhill family as the horrific nature of their crimes became apparent. By October 18, 1967, the Texas Rangers and FBI had established a joint task force, converting an abandoned school building in nearby Henderson into a command center for what would become one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in American history. "We need everyone to remain composed and professional," instructed Texas Ranger Captain Harold Mitchum during the first briefing. "What we're dealing with here will test the constitution of even the most seasoned law enforcement officer. Remember, our job is to collect evidence, find victims, and build a case that will ensure these people never see freedom again." More disturbing than initially believed was the evidence uncovered by the methodical search of the Thornhill property. Behind the main house, investigators discovered a smokehouse containing human remains in various stages of preparation. Carbon dating would later reveal that this practice had been ongoing for at least 4 decades. In a separate building apparently used as a birthing center, they found detailed records of every birth on the property since 1930. Each entry included clinical descriptions of physical abnormalities, a viability assessment, and a final designation, keeper or provider. Those labeled as providers had no further records, no education notations, no work assignments. Nothing indicated they had continued as part of the family. They had simply disappeared from the documents, consumed by their own bloodline. The level of organization was chilling, FBI Special Agent Leonard Pierce would later write in his memoir. This wasn't some explosion of psychotic behavior. This was a systematized generational practice with its own internal logic and record keeping. Involving interviewing the surviving Thornhill family members was the most difficult aspect of the investigation. Many displayed obvious cognitive impairments resulting from generations of inbreeding. Others demonstrated a complete moral dissociation that stunned even veteran interrogators. Matilda Thornhill, 62, spoke matter-of-factly about the family's practices. The strong ones live and work. The simple ones return their strength to the family. That's the natural way of things. When shown photographs of children who had disappeared, she displayed no emotional reaction, merely commenting on whether they had made good stew or not. Investigators were particularly interested in Silas Thornhill Jr., 47, who appeared to have assumed leadership of the family in recent years. Unlike many family members, Silas showed no obvious physical signs of genetic disorders and possessed an unsettling intellectual clarity. Educated by his grandfather from books collected over generations, Silas had developed a pseudoscientific justification for the family's practices. "Your society wastes resources on the weak," he told investigators during his 3rd interview. "We understood efficiency long before your scientists. When the vessel is flawed, the essence must be reclaimed and repurposed. The flesh returns to strengthen the bloodline." Among the most disturbing discoveries was a handwritten manual titled The Preparation of Providers, which detailed methods for determining which children would be designated as food sources, how they should be raised until harvest, and instructions for butchering and preparing human flesh. Forensic analysis indicated this document had been updated and expanded over at least 3 generations. An unexpected turn was taken by the investigation when investigators began analyzing the family's extensive records. Amidst birth logs and crude genetic charts, they discovered documentation of occasional introductions, instances where outsiders had been brought into the family. These weren't merely kidnappings. They represented calculated attempts to introduce new genetic material into the increasingly compromised Thornhill bloodline. They understood on some primitive level that their inbreeding was causing problems, explained Dr. Elena Simmons, a geneticist consulted by the FBI. But rather than stop their consanguineous practices, they periodically abducted outsiders to temporarily strengthen their gene pool. Records suggested that over the past 40 years, at least 17 people had been abducted and integrated into the family through forced marriage and breeding. Once they had produced children, these outsiders typically disappeared, with family records indicating they had been processed like other providers. Leave a comment with "This is so disturbing" if you're as shocked as I am by these historical events. Your engagement helps the algorithm share this educational content with others who want to understand these dark chapters of history. A devastating catalogue of genetic disorders resulting from generations of consanguineous relationships was revealed by the medical and scientific examination of the surviving Thornhill family members. In December 1967, a team led by Dr. Harrison Wells from the Baylor College of Medicine conducted comprehensive examinations of the 19 living Thornhills at a secure facility outside Dallas. "What we're seeing here is unprecedented in modern medical literature," Dr. Wells reported. "The cumulative effect of inbreeding coefficients this high has produced genetic complications I've never encountered outside textbook worst-case scenarios. Rarely documented in human populations were the levels of inbreeding the Thornhill family had reached. While first-cousin marriages, an inbreeding coefficient of 0.0625, can increase the risk of birth defects by approximately 2 to 3%, the Thornhill family had practiced much closer consanguineous relationships over multiple generations, resulting in inbreeding coefficients estimated at between 0.25 and 0.375, levels that virtually guaranteed serious genetic disorders. The medical examination revealed a pattern of recessive genetic diseases that had become increasingly severe with each generation. Among the younger Thornhills, 5th and 6th generations, over 80% displayed significant intellectual disability, with IQ measurements ranging from 25 to 65. Several were unable to speak in complete sentences or perform basic self-care. 11 family members suffered from polydactyly, extra fingers or toes, and 9 had syndactyly, fused digits. These conditions had become so common they were considered normal. Present in nearly all members was facial dysmorphism, including abnormally close-set eyes, malformed ears, and pronounced prognathism, protruding jaw. 7 members had been born with heart defects, though only those with milder conditions had survived to adulthood. Perhaps most disturbing was the emergence of novel genetic disorders that the medical team couldn't classify. According to existing literature, 3 of the younger Thornhills exhibited a previously undocumented syndrome involving progressive muscular atrophy combined with hyperactive metabolic function. They remained ravenously hungry despite muscle wastage and required nearly constant feeding. In effect, they've created genetic disorders that don't exist in the general population, explained Dr. Amelia Richardson, a geneticist who consulted on the case. With such a restricted gene pool, recessive mutations that might occur in perhaps 1 in several million people in the general population became virtually guaranteed within this family. A perverse genetic logic to it was discovered by the medical team regarding the Thornhills' practice of consuming their own kin. Family records indicated that those selected for processing typically displayed the most severe manifestations of genetic disorders. By removing these individuals from the breeding population, the family was attempting a crude form of eugenics. They were practicing a primitive, horrific form of genetic selection, Dr. Richardson noted. But ironically, by continuing to breed within their restricted family group, they were simultaneously ensuring that these genetic problems would not only persist but worsen over time. A significant contribution to understanding the consequences of extreme inbreeding in humans was made by the scientific study of the Thornhill case, knowledge that had previously been limited to theoretical models or observations in laboratory animals. Several academic papers were published based on anonymized data from the case, though the full details remained classified for decades. Another disturbing pattern was revealed by dental examinations. Many family members displayed unusual wear patterns on their teeth consistent with a diet significantly different from typical American eating habits of the era. The dental evidence suggests a long-term diet unusually high in certain proteins and low in processed carbohydrates, reported Dr. Lawrence Freeman, forensic odontologist. The wear patterns are consistent with regular consumption of undercooked human flesh. Elevated levels of certain minerals and compounds associated with cannibalism were found in hair and tissue samples from family members. Indeed, 3 of the older Thornhill family members exhibited symptoms consistent with early-stage prion disease, including tremors, ataxia, impaired coordination, and periods of confusion. This suggested that their cannibalistic practices had continued long enough to trigger these rare conditions. Another dimension of their isolation was revealed by blood type analysis. While the general American population displays significant diversity, 18 of the 19 Thornhills had type A blood, with only 1 member having type AB, likely inherited from one of the outsiders forcibly brought into the family decades earlier. The homogeneity of blood types is another indicator of extreme genetic isolation, Dr. Wells noted. In a normal population sample of this size, we would expect to see all major blood types represented. In February 1968 began the legal proceedings against the Thornhill family, though they were conducted with unprecedented secrecy. Due to the disturbing nature of the crimes and concerns about copycat behaviors, Judge William Harrington ordered the courtroom sealed and all documents classified. The trial would not be open to the public or press, with only essential court personnel, selected law enforcement, and expert witnesses permitted to attend. The details of this case are so profoundly disturbing that making them public would serve no constructive purpose, Judge Harrington wrote in his sealing order. The public's right to information must be balanced against potential harm to the community and the dignity of the victims. Unique challenges were faced by the prosecution, led by District Attorney George Whitman. How could they present such extreme crimes without causing psychological trauma? How would they find jurors who could remain impartial after hearing such evidence? Ultimately, the decision was made to waive a jury trial, with the case instead presented directly to Judge Harrington in a bench trial. 7 adult Thornhill family members were deemed competent to stand trial: Silas Jr., James, Matilda, Ruth, Joseph, Abigail, and Thomas. They faced charges including murder, kidnapping, false imprisonment, abuse of a corpse, and, in a legal first for Texas, ritualized cannibalism, which was prosecuted under rarely used statutes dating back to the 19th century. The remaining 12 family members were deemed incompetent due to severe cognitive disabilities and were committed to secure psychiatric facilities for the rest of their lives, their very existence classified as state secrets. Just 9 days lasted the trial, with the prosecution presenting overwhelming physical evidence, family records, and testimony from law enforcement and scientific experts. Little resistance was offered by the defense, assigned by the court after no lawyers would voluntarily represent the Thornhills. Their primary argument, that isolated communities develop their own moral standards that shouldn't be judged by mainstream society, gained no traction with Judge Harrington. On March 3, 1968, all 7 defendants were found guilty on all counts. Judge Harrington's voice reportedly trembled as he delivered his verdict, calling the Thornhill case the most profound perversion of family bonds this court has ever encountered or hopes to encounter again. Unequivocal was the sentencing. The 5 male defendants received death sentences, while the 2 females received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a gender distinction reflecting the jurisprudence of the era rather than any difference in culpability. What happened next remains a subject of controversy and conspiracy theories. Official records indicate that Silas Jr., James, Joseph, and Thomas Thornhill were executed by electric chair at Huntsville Prison on September 12, 1969. However, recently declassified documents suggest the executions may never have occurred. Instead, these documents hint at a classified government program that took custody of the Thornhills for intensive scientific study, codenamed Project Heritage. This alleged research initiative sought to understand the genetic, psychological, and sociological factors that had created the Thornhill situation. The scientific value of studying these individuals outweighs the public demand for traditional justice, reads one partially redacted memo attributed to a federal agency. The unique combination of extreme genetic isolation and aberrant behavioral development presents an unprecedented research opportunity. Whether executed as officially reported or secretly studied in government facilities, the Thornhill defendants effectively disappeared from history. The family property was razed completely, with all structures burned to the ground and the ashes buried under tons of soil and concrete. The land was incorporated into a national forest, its specific location deliberately obscured on maps. Profound was the impact on the law enforcement officers and medical professionals involved in the case. Sheriff Calloway resigned his position 6 months after the trial and moved to Oregon, where he reportedly suffered from alcoholism and nightmares until his death in 1983. For other officers involved in the initial investigation eventually took their own lives, a statistical anomaly some attribute to the psychological trauma of what they witnessed. Dr. Harrison Wells, who led the medical examinations, abandoned his promising academic career to become a rural general practitioner. In a rare interview granted shortly before his death in 2002, he alluded to the case without naming it. There are things humans can do that recalibrate your entire understanding of our species. After seeing that, I couldn't continue as before. Its own response to the trauma was developed by the community of Russ County. By unspoken agreement, the Thornhill case was never discussed publicly. When outsiders asked about the family or the case, locals claimed ignorance or changed the subject. Schools avoided teaching local history from this period, and newspaper archives mysteriously lost all relevant articles. It was a collective decision to excise this cancer from our community's memory, explained Reverend Thomas Parker in a 2010 oral history project, breaking the silence for the first time. Some horrors are so great that remembering them serves no purpose but to perpetuate the darkness. As decades passed, the Thornhill case faded from even classified memory. By the early 2000s, most individuals with direct knowledge had died or retired. The sealed records gathered dust in government archives, their significance forgotten until a routine declassification review in 2018 brought portions of the case back to light. Today, the Thornhill case stands as one of the most extreme examples of the dangers of genetic isolation and familial abuse. While many details remain classified, enough information has emerged to serve as a sobering reminder of humanity's potential for both biological and moral degradation when cut off from the broader social fabric. If you've made it to the end of this disturbing historical account, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with others who appreciate learning about these dark chapters of history. Your engagement helps us continue bringing educational content about these important, if disturbing, historical events.